At a small-town gas station, tension crackled in the air. A biker in a black leather jacket stood surrounded by angry voices, accused of cheating because he had no cash. Phones were raised. Laughter echoed through the crowd. Just when it seemed he would be humiliated, a 60-year-old black woman stepped forward. Clara Johnson looked straight at them and said calmly, "If no cash makes him a criminal, then shame is on this town." The crowd froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Stories like this remind us that kindness can shatter the walls of prejudice. How would you feel standing in Clara's shoes, choosing compassion when everyone else chose judgment? Share your thoughts in the comments, and wherever you are, may your day be filled with courage and good heart. The year was fading into late autumn, and Hawthorne sat quietly at the edge of the state highway like a forgotten outpost. The mornings carried a gray haze that never lifted, and the evenings seemed to fall too soon, smothering the streets in shadow long before the lamps sputtered to life. The cracked pavement of Main Street bore the scars of decades without repair. Storefronts lined with weather-worn signs swayed gently in the cold wind, and the windows of shuttered diners revealed only emptiness where life once bustled. Hawthorne was a town people did not dream of entering, and those who lived there rarely dreamed of leaving, a place where silence was heavy and suspicion clung to every glance. Among its narrow lanes and fading structures stood a small wooden house with peeling white paint and a crooked porch that sagged under the weight of years. Inside lived Clara Johnson, a black woman of 60, her hair streaked with gray but pulled neatly back into a bun, her dark eyes sharp with endurance. Her back had curved slightly from decades of carrying burdens greater than her body was built for, yet she stood tall with a quiet dignity that refused to break. Beside her lived her younger sister Ruth, frail and pale from long years of illness, her voice soft and breath short, but her spirit stubborn enough to resist the sickness that held her captive. Together, the two women kept watch over a house that had become more than a home. It was a refuge. This house was called Safe Haven, though few in town spoke the name with kindness. Clara had opened its doors to children no one else wanted, abandoned infants left at hospital steps, disabled boys and girls shuffled through foster homes until no one would take them, little ones with twisted limbs, quiet eyes, or speech that never came. There were 12 in all, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, each carrying scars that spoke louder than their words. The house was filled with mismatched cribs, squeaky beds, and patched blankets, but also with the sounds of laughter that Clara fought to keep alive. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To Clara, it was purpose. Yet in Hawthorne, compassion was rarely rewarded. The townspeople whispered as she walked past, clutching her faded flyers printed on cheap paper. They called her a beggar who lived on pity, a woman too foolish to mind her own survival, someone clinging to lost causes in a place that had none to spare. At the diner, old men with lined faces shook their heads, muttering that she should take care of her own instead of parading charity. Women on their way to church pulled their coats tighter, as if goodness might stain them if they came too close. Even teenagers on their bikes, restless and reckless, mocked her as she passed, sneering that no one wanted her or the dump she called a shelter. Clara bore it in silence, her stride steady, her chin level, her eyes fixed forward. She had known rejection since childhood, when she lost both parents before she was 10 and was passed from couch to couch until her grandmother, Miss Edna, finally took her in. It was Miss Edna who taught her never to apologize for who she was and always to stand for those without a voice. Now, with Edna gone, Clara carried that lesson like a shield. Still, every cruel word left its mark. Each insult lingered, piling upon the exhaustion already pressing her shoulders, but she refused to bend. The one who embodied the town's coldness most clearly was Mayor Henry Brown. In his late 60s, with graying hair brushed back and a tailored suit that always seemed a little too polished for the town's decay, he was a man who thrived on keeping distance. Whenever Clara crossed his path, perhaps outside the courthouse or by the town square, he would adjust his tie, clear his throat, and turn away, as if her presence were a stain on his careful image. He was not openly cruel, but his avoidance carried a sharper wound, for silence can condemn louder than shouts. Still, Clara walked the streets each week, flyers in hand, her old sedan rattling down broken roads as she delivered them to bulletin boards and grocery counters. She printed them with the last of her money, ink already fading, edges curling in the damp air. The words across the top read, "Safe Haven, Shelter for Abandoned and Disabled Children. We need your help." The children she cared for knew the rhythm of her absence, waiting at the windows until she returned, sometimes empty-handed, sometimes with a bag of bread, and always with a tired smile that told them nothing had been wasted. On cold evenings, when the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, Clara would gather the children around the kitchen table, telling them stories while stirring thin soup that she stretched as far as she could. Her sister Ruth would sit by the stove, coughing into a handkerchief, but humming an old hymn that steadied the air. The children leaned close to Clara, not just for warmth, but for reassurance, because in her presence they felt anchored, as if she could hold back the entire town's contempt with the strength of her will alone. Yet every night, after the children had gone to bed, Clara would stand at the window, staring out at the empty street, the lamppost flickering as though unsure it should even keep shining. She thought of the judgment she faced, of the constant struggle to feed the children, of the roof that leaked with every storm, and of the way people crossed the street to avoid her. It would have been easier to close her doors, to say she had done enough. But then she would remember the faces of the children, the ones who had nowhere else to go, the ones who clung to her hand as if it were the only solid thing in their world. And she would whisper to herself, with a voice steady and sure, "If not me, then who?" In the heart of Hawthorne, where suspicion hung heavier than the fog, Clara Johnson chose to keep fighting. She moved through the days not as a woman seeking approval, but as a guardian holding a fragile line between despair and hope. And though the town dismissed her as a fool clinging to pity, she carried within her a conviction that no amount of disdain could erode. Safe Haven was not just a house, it was a defiance, a statement carved out of struggle. Love could exist even where prejudice never slept. The sky over Hawthorne was darker than usual that afternoon, clouds pressing low against the crooked rooftops as if the whole town were bracing for something it could not name. Clara's sedan, dented and weary, rattled as she steered it down Main Street, the muffler coughing with each mile. The gas gauge had hovered near empty all morning, and with no choice left, she guided the old car toward the corner station, its faded yellow sign flickering weakly in the gloom. The building leaned into the wind like a relic that should have been torn down years ago, but it remained because nothing in Hawthorne ever truly changed. The station was alive with voices, not of business, but of idleness. A handful of townsfolk lingered near the entrance, clutching paper cups of coffee, trading gossip, and waiting for any excuse to point their suspicions outward. Clara pulled up to the farthest pump, stepping from her car with her gray coat wrapped tight, her eyes cast downward to avoid the weight of their stares. She inserted the nozzle into the tank and listened to the sluggish hum of fuel, the sound nearly lost beneath the chatter drifting through the chilly air. Then came a voice that sliced through the quiet like a blade. Across the lot stood a tall man beside a gleaming motorcycle, his leather jacket marked by the bold insignia of the Hells Angels. Tattoos curled down his arms, his dark hair tied back, his face rugged, weathered by years of hardship in the road. His name was Jake Iron Hand Wallace, though in that moment he was only a stranger surrounded by suspicion. Opposite him stood Carl Dixon, the stocky attendant with a cap stained by grease, his red face contorted in triumph as he jabbed a finger toward the biker. "Men like you are all the same," Carl barked, his voice carrying across the pumps. "No cash, no gas. You think because you ride in here with that monster you can ignore the rules." The words were meant not only for Jake, but for the crowd, and they responded eagerly. "Call the sheriff," a woman shouted, clutching her purse tighter. A boy in a torn hoodie laughed as he raised his phone to record, his grin wide with anticipation. An older man leaned against his pickup, arms crossed, smirking at the drama unfolding like free entertainment on a dull afternoon. Jake's hands lifted slowly, palms open, his voice steady though strained. "I'm not here to cheat anyone. I thought I could pay by phone. Everywhere else takes it. I gave my last cash to a boy who needed it. I just need gas to get home. My mother is sick, and I don't have time for this." His words carried sincerity, but they dissolved against the wall of prejudice that met him. The crowd laughed, their judgment unmoved, their eyes fixed not on the man but on the jacket and the image they had already condemned. Clara's grip on the pump tightened, her pulse drumming with a memory she had never escaped. She had lived this injustice, being cast as guilty before any question was asked, punished not for deeds but for the color of her skin. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on her shoulders, demanding silence. But she had learned long ago that silence was the ally of cruelty. She released the pump handle, her steps steady as she walked into the storm of voices that swirled around Jake. The crowd shifted, some rolling their eyes, others smirking at the sight of an old black woman daring to interfere. Clara's figure was slender but tall, her hair tied neatly into its bun, her eyes unwavering as she fixed them on Carl. Her voice carried more than sound. It carried a lifetime of defiance. "He did not refuse to pay," she said, each word measured. "He only lacks the method you demand. If that alone is enough for the sheriff, then I must have been guilty my entire life." The words fell heavy across the lot, cutting sharper than any accusation. The boy lowered his phone, the grin fading. The woman with the purse drew back, uncertain. Even Carl's voice faltered, his lips parted but no sound escaping as Clara's gaze held his firmly. The laughter that had bubbled moments before choked into uneasy silence, and the storm above seemed to echo the pause, the first drops of rain hissing against the cracked pavement. For the first time, shame flickered across the faces of those who had shouted loudest, though none dared admit it. Clara reached into her worn wallet, the leather soft from years of use, and drew out a stack of wrinkled bills. Each one had been saved carefully, meant for bread, for medicine, for flyers to keep Safe Haven alive. She extended them with hands that did not tremble, her voice low but resolute. "I do not buy gratitude," she said, her words deliberate. "I buy fairness." Carl snatched the bills, his pride dulled, his mutterings swallowed by the sound of the register printing its reluctant receipt. Around them, the crowd shuffled, eyes darting to the ground as though trying to vanish from their own reflection. Without waiting for thanks, Clara turned back to her sedan, her coat brushing against her legs, her stride unbroken beneath the weight of every stare. She pulled open the door, the hinges groaning, and lowered herself into the seat. As the door closed, the wind tugged at her wallet, pulling a flyer free, sending it fluttering to the ground. Jake bent quickly, his gloved hand catching it before the rain could stain the ink. His gray eyes lingered on the words. "Safe Haven, shelter for abandoned and disabled children. We need your help." He folded it slowly, tucking it into his pocket, the weight of Clara's voice echoing within him as her car rattled away into the storm. A week had passed since the storm at the gas station, though its memory lingered in Clara's mind as vividly as the scent of gasoline that clung to her old sedan. Life at Safe Haven had returned to its rhythm of labor and need, with repairs to make, children to feed, and faith to summon from dwindling supplies. The wooden walls still bore cracks, patched hastily with fresh paint, and Clara's hands were stained with white streaks from the brush, proof that she worked long after the children slept. On that late afternoon, she sat on the porch steps, her palms resting on her knees, her gaze wandering toward the horizon where the sky threatened rain once again. The air was quiet, broken only by the laughter of children within and the faint rasp of Ruth's cough drifting through the doorway. Yet Clara's eyes betrayed unease, for the pantry was nearly bare, its shelves offering little more than a few cans and a half-empty bag of rice. She rubbed her thumb against her palm, smudging dried paint, while her thoughts turned to how she might stretch another day from nothing. The weight of her promise to the children pressed heavy, but she bore it with the quiet resolve that had carried her through 60 years of storms harsher than weather. Then, like a tremor in the distance, the sound began, low and scattered at first, then growing into a thunderous roll. Engines, not one but many, their rhythm steady as drums of war. Clara's head lifted sharply, and her heart clenched as the rumble grew nearer, shaking the ground beneath the porch. The children inside fell silent before rushing toward the windows, their wide eyes filled with fear. Outside, townsfolk stopped mid-step, their conversations cut short as the chorus of engines drew closer, each one louder than the last until it sounded like the sky itself was tearing open. Around the bend, they appeared. A convoy of Harley-Davidsons, black chrome gleaming, headlights slicing through the gloom like blades of fire. Dozens of riders filled the narrow road, leather jackets heavy with patches, tattoos crawling across arms and necks, their faces hidden behind helmets and visors. To the people of Hawthorne, it was the very image of menace, an invasion on wheels. Cries rang out from across the street, "They're here for revenge!" And a woman pulled her child indoors, slamming the door shut with a snap. Fear spread like wildfire, each whisper twisting darker than the last. Inside Safe Haven, the children panicked, scattering toward corners, clutching at Clara's skirts as though she alone could shield them. Their voices tumbled over one another in terror, begging her not to let the men outside through. Ruth, frail but unyielding, leaned against the doorframe, her lips pressed thin with worry. Yet Clara rose slowly, her back straight, her voice calm, though her heart thundered. "Stay behind me," she told the children, prying their small hands gently from her dress. She walked to the gate and stood before it, her figure framed by the fragile wooden arch, refusing to step aside. The engines cut one by one, the silence that followed more deafening than the roar itself. From the front of the line, a man dismounted, tall, broad-shouldered, leather jacket stretched across his frame, helmet tucked under one arm. Jake Wallace. He strode across the gravel, his boots striking the ground with deliberate weight, and as he drew closer, the hardened mask of his face gave way to something quieter, something steady. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, smoothing it against his palm before holding it up. "You dropped this at the station," he said, his gravelly voice carrying easily through the stillness. His eyes flicked from the flyer to Clara, then to the battered house behind her, its sagging roof, its peeling paint, the faded curtains that barely concealed frightened faces. His jaw tightened, and he lifted his gaze back to meet hers, the flyer trembling faintly in his grip. "You helped me when the whole town turned its back. Now it's our turn." At his signal, the back of a truck swung open, the creak of metal echoing in the hush. Inside lay crates stacked high boxes of food, bags of rice and beans, cartons of milk, bundles of medicine, even planks of wood and buckets of paint. The riders, their arms tattooed, their faces lined by sun and road, moved without a word. One after another, they lifted the supplies, carrying them toward the shelter with a quiet discipline that contrasted sharply with the image the town had painted of them. Boots thudded against the gravel, leather creaked, and the broken porch groaned as they stepped onto it. But every motion spoke of purpose, not threat. From the street, the people of Hawthorne gathered, their fear transforming into disbelief as the scene unfolded. Men who had whispered "criminal" now watched bikers carry sacks of flour through the shelter door. Women who had pulled their children close now saw rough hands pass toys gently to waiting little ones. No words were spoken among the crowd. Their silence was the sound of walls cracking, of prejudice struggling against evidence it could not deny. Clara herself stood frozen, her lips parting though no sound escaped, her eyes blurring with the sting of unshed tears. Jake paused before her again, the flyer still in his hand, its ink faded, its corners worn. "This place matters," he said softly, though his voice carried the firmness of iron. "You stood for me when it would have been easier to walk away. That kind of courage doesn't go unanswered." He gestured toward his men as they moved steadily in and out, their rough silhouettes softened by the light spilling from the shelter windows. "We're not here to scare your town. We're here to stand with you." Clara drew a breath that trembled, her throat tight, her heart swelling beneath the weight of what unfolded before her. For the first time in years, she was not alone in carrying Safe Haven on her shoulders. She looked at Jake, at the flyer in his hand, at the steady stream of supplies entering her fragile home, and the tears she had held back slipped free. Her voice, when it came, was little more than a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the porch. "Thank you." The words cracked under their own weight, yet in them lived all the strength she had left. And in that moment, with children peeking from windows and neighbors staring in stunned silence, Clara Johnson felt the shelter breathe again. The week that began with the roar of motorcycles ended with something no one in Hawthorne had imagined. Each morning, the engines returned not with menace, but with purpose, their riders dismounting to trade steel and leather for paintbrushes, hammers, and the steady patience of men determined to rebuild what had long been ignored. The children who once trembled at their arrival now gathered eagerly at the porch, their laughter rising above the thud of hammers and the scrape of ladders. Clara, her hands stained with dried paint, stood in quiet wonder as Safe Haven slowly began to shed its scars. On the front lawn, a pair of bikers lifted buckets of green paint, coating the weather-beaten walls until the shelter shone with a vibrancy that seemed almost defiant against years of neglect. Another balanced on the roof, his thick arms driving nails with precision, sealing the leaks that had haunted every storm. Below, a man with tattoos snaking up his arms crouched low beside a boy in a wheelchair, pushing him gently across the yard until the child's laughter burst out like a song that broke the silence of old fears. For once, the yard was filled not with whispers of pity, but with the sound of life being restored. Across the street, townsfolk gathered as they always had, their arms crossed and their eyes narrow, suspicion written in every line of their faces. Old men leaned against rusted trucks, muttering about appearances, while women clutched their children close, torn between fear and the undeniable pull of curiosity. "They're criminals playing dress-up," one voice insisted. Another scoffed that it was only a matter of time before trouble returned. The divide between what they saw and what they believed grew wider, leaving them stranded in their own doubts. The tension cracked when a group of younger men, their anger sharpened by prejudice, began to speak of calling the sheriff. Their voices rose, carried across the yard, declaring that the law had no place for men like Jake and his crew. The children fell silent at the sound, their wide eyes darting nervously toward Clara, who stood firm though her stomach clenched. The bikers paused in their work, the stillness of their figures more imposing than any argument. And then Jake stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying like iron in the air. "If helping orphans is a crime," he said, his tone low and unwavering, "then we're ready to be arrested." The words dropped heavy against the silence, striking harder than any threat could. The defiant men faltered, their bravado dimmed by the sheer clarity of Jake's declaration. There was no defense, no counter-argument, for the truth lay bare before them. Around the edges of the crowd, heads turned, whispers faded, and a shift began that no one could have predicted. From within the silence, a single figure emerged. An older man, his back bent from years of labor, stepped forward carrying a box of bricks. His face was lined, his shirt smeared with dust, but his eyes carried a quiet determination. Without a word, he crossed the invisible boundary and set the bricks down in the yard, the sound of their weight louder than any speech. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as he turned back, his action leaving space for others to follow. Soon a woman approached, her apron dusted with flour, carrying a bundle of nails. Then a young man pushed a wheelbarrow filled with sand. One by one, the townsfolk began to move. Clara's breath caught as she watched. For years she had stood alone, her pleas for help drowned in ridicule and silence. But now the tide was shifting before her eyes. The yard filled with an unlikely mixture of leather vests and work shirts, tattooed arms and calloused hands, all moving toward a common purpose. Paintbrushes passed from biker to baker, hammers shared between outlaw and farmer, and laughter rose as children darted between them, no longer afraid. What began as an act of defiance had become something larger, a community unlearning its fear. On the third day, a black sedan rolled slowly down the street, polished to a shine that contrasted sharply with the dust and gravel of Hawthorne's roads. From it stepped Mayor Henry Brown, his hair silver and combed neatly, his suit immaculate even in the heat of the afternoon. His presence drew murmurs from the crowd, for he was a man known more for distance than engagement, a figure who avoided controversy by pretending it did not exist. He stood at the edge of the yard, his eyes sharp yet hesitant, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched without speaking. The mayor's gaze fell on a moment he could not ignore. A towering biker, his arms heavy with ink, carefully lifting a frail boy from his wheelchair and carrying him onto the freshly repaired porch. The child's laughter rang clear, his joy spilling into the air like sunlight piercing through clouds. For a long moment, Mayor Brown said nothing, his face betraying the war within him between doubt and recognition. Then, with a slow breath, he stepped forward, crossing the gravel that had long marked the line between him and those he judged. It was the smallest of gestures, yet to Clara it was monumental. By the week's end, Safe Haven was nearly unrecognizable. The once peeling walls now gleamed a proud shade of green, the roof strong and unyielding against the weather, the porch sturdy enough to carry the weight of laughter and life. Inside, the pantry brimmed with food, the medicine cabinet filled with supplies, and the children no longer huddled in fear but played freely in the yard. More than the shelter itself, it was the eyes of the townsfolk that had changed. Where once there had been only suspicion, now curiosity glimmered, softening into respect. Clara stood in the doorway, her heart full, knowing that Safe Haven's walls had been rebuilt not only with wood and paint, but with the first fragile threads of trust. Late summer settled over Hawthorne with a warmth that carried both weariness and promise, the sun sinking low behind the tree line as lanterns and string lights flickered to life across the yard of Safe Haven. Where once the shelter had stood in shadow and silence, now it glowed with golden light, spilling across the fresh green walls and sturdy porch that bore the marks of transformation. The air hummed with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief, for the gathering that night was unlike anything the town had ever witnessed. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, her hands clasped, watching as neighbors and strangers alike began to fill the yard. The scent of grilled food drifted from the side of the house, where townsfolk had set up long tables, lined with bread, corn, and dishes shared freely. Children darted between the adults, laughter ringing through the night as they played tag with bikers who pushed them in wheelchairs or lifted them high onto tattooed shoulders. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid Clara now carried trays of lemonade, offering them to men in leather vests with nods that were hesitant but sincere. For the first time, Safe Haven's yard felt less like a boundary and more like a hearth, a place that drew people in rather than holding them at bay. The bikers stood among the crowd, their rough edges softened by the glow of string lights and the innocent joy of children tugging at their hands. Some leaned on their motorcycles parked in a neat line, chrome gleaming under the lamps, while others laughed openly, their voices mingling with townsfolk in conversations that, a month before, would have been unthinkable. Jake Wallace moved quietly through it all, speaking little but nodding to each child who smiled at him, his gray eyes scanning the gathering with a cautious pride. To him, this was not a spectacle, it was a promise kept. At the front of the yard, a wooden stage had been built hastily but with care, planks nailed together by bikers and townsfolk alike, decorated with flowers picked from nearby fields. Mayor Henry Brown stood upon it now, his polished shoes gleaming under the lights, his face paler than usual under the weight of what he was about to say. The crowd hushed gradually, the murmur of voices fading into the soft hum of cicadas, until only the crackle of lantern flames remained. Brown's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, his voice faltering at first but gathering strength as it carried into the still night. "Clara Johnson," he began, pausing as the name itself seemed to echo through the silence. "For compassion beyond measure, and for the heart you have given to those the world has forgotten." His words were simple, but in them lived an admission the town had resisted for years. From behind him, a young man stepped forward holding a wooden plaque, its surface smooth, the letters carved with care. Clara Johnson, for compassion, courage, and the heart of Hope Haven. Brown's hands shook as he passed it to Clara, his eyes betraying something unfamiliar, humility. Clara stepped forward slowly, the children at her side watching with wide eyes, her own gaze lowered to the plaque she now held. The first applause was hesitant, a scattering of claps that cracked the silence, uncertain and fragile. Then it grew, gathering strength like a tide rolling in, until the yard shook with the sound of voices and hands raised together. The applause became thunder, echoing against the walls of Safe Haven and into the night, not as pity but as respect finally spoken aloud. Clara's chest tightened, her breath caught, and tears burned hot as they welled in her eyes. She lifted the plaque high enough for all to see, her voice steady though lined with emotion. "Hope is not a building," she said, the words flowing slow and deliberate. "Hope is when people choose to look beyond prejudice. Hope is when we see human beings, not skin, not tattoos, not the jackets they wear." The words carried across the yard, weaving into the hearts of those who had gathered, their meaning undeniable. Faces that once twisted in judgment now softened, and heads bowed in recognition of the truth laid bare before them. The bikers, moved by her words though not given to sentiment, began to stir. Jake glanced toward his men, and without a word they moved toward their machines. One by one, engines roared to life, their growl filling the yard like a storm reborn. But this time, there was no fear, no whispers of trouble, only the rising cheer of townsfolk who stood, clapping in rhythm with the engine's thunder. Children covered their ears but laughed, their eyes wide with wonder, and even the mayor managed a thin smile as he nodded in reluctant approval. The night became a celebration, not of perfection, but of possibility. Townsfolk and bikers shared food, children ran freely, and laughter rose like smoke from a fire long rekindled. Clara stood at the center, the plaque pressed against her chest, her tears spilling freely now, her smile radiant under the golden lights. For the first time in her long life, she felt the weight of her struggle lift. Not because the fight was over, but because she no longer carried it alone. Hope Haven was no longer just a shelter, it had become the beating heart of Hawthorne. And as the cicadas hummed, the lanterns flickered, and the engines roared like a hymn in the distance, Clara Johnson knew she was no longer merely surviving. She was seen, she was heard, and in the eyes of the community that now surrounded her, she was home. In the end, this story reminds us that true strength lies not in walls or judgments, but in the courage to look past them. Those who rise above prejudice, who act with quiet compassion and sacrifice without seeking praise, are the ones who change the world in ways we may never forget. Their actions teach us that kindness can bridge even the deepest divides. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to join us on more journeys of humanity and resilience. May God bless you and your loved ones as you walk your own path of compassion.